interpreted from the stay-at-home, from the housewife perspective, and that's not what women who carry water 20 miles are interested in.
Are you, do I just start whatever I want to?
You start,
Is it the camera's on now? Great, excellent. Okay, good afternoon everyone. We are going to look in this session at how to address the multitude of motions that are out there that get set at all sorts of debating competitions, which begin either this house would ban something or this house would legalise something. And we're going to look at a variety of the types of arguments and types of principles that can underlie a lot of these issues, although obviously they need to always be adjusted and adapted for the particular topic that we're looking at. I think it's really useful to think about these because, as I say, they do come up a lot, and by identifying some of those consistent issues, when you've got your 15 minutes to prepare for a topic, you don't have to spend a long time kind of identifying some of the issues in that sense, and then you can spend more time really thinking about how to tailor your analysis in a really specific way to a way that's going to make all the difference on that motion. To start off with, I want to just say that I'm going to be dealing really with the idea of where it's a national government that's going to ban or legalise something. That's not the case in every ban legalise motion. Sometimes you might have issues where the agent who's being asked to ban something is the WTO or the UN or sort of international body in that sense, or it might be smaller than a national government. We did an example of a motion earlier on banning embedded journalists in military conflicts. That doesn't necessarily have to be a national government. That could be a press association that chose to ban something like that. You might, if something's being banned specifically for drugs being banned, it might be a medical association that's banning that in some sense. So it's not every ban motion is actually a national government in that way, but that's what we're going to concentrate on today. I think all legalised motions by their nature are national governments because it's them who can pass the laws in that sense to legalise things. But we're going to talk today about, as I say, those national governments issues. Now I want to just run through a whole sort of range of the types of ban and legalised motions that you might come up against in competitions, because it did occur to me that I sort of started by thinking, so many motions are banned and legalised, and then I thought about all the motions we've done so far this week, and of course none of them so far this week actually have been banned or legalised, so you might not believe me in that sense. But some examples, and we can use these examples as we go through and think about issues. Things you might ban in a debate: you might ban smoking, you might ban smacking, you might ban alcohol, gambling, you might ban cars from city centres, you might ban animal testing or blood sports, you might ban size 0 models from being used in fashion shoots, you might ban abortion, you might ban private education. You might ban pro-anorexia websites, you might ban certain forms of pornography, handguns, the payment of ransom, a whole variety of things that you might ban. Now some of those things are things that you might recognise as already being banned within your own country. Obviously this is one of those ones where status quos are going to vary throughout the world in that sense. So whereas an American can have a debate on banning handguns, in Britain we'd need to have the debate this house would legalise handguns because they're already legalised there. Some examples of the sorts of things that you might be asked to legalise: you might be asked to legalise drugs or performance enhancing drugs in sport. You might be asked to legalise prostitution, euthanasia, sale of organs, polygamy, sadomasochism, incest, consensual duelling. There's an idea. All sorts of issues of things that in some countries or in the majority of countries are at the moment banned and that you might be called upon to legalise. So there's a whole range of issues that might come up. And I want to talk first and foremost about in some ways the most important issue that underlies any of this debate, which is the idea of what should our laws do, what should our government do? Where should it allow people to do whatever they want, and where should it step in and stop us doing things in that sense? These ideas generally of the kind of role of the government in one way or another. I'm going to go on also at the time to just sort of flag up for you some different other sorts of arguments that come up in these debates, and if we've got time, look in a little bit more depth about how they work. But I want to concentrate first and foremost on this particular issue. It's worth saying as well something about definitions in a ban and legalise debate before we do that. If you're first government and you are given a motion on legalise, it needs to set a big alarm bell off in your head that you need to put quite a lot into your model, into the framework in which you're legalising something. All right, if you can't just, in most debates, you can't just sort of legalise euthanasia or something and just say, yeah, that's it. What we do is we just legalise euthanasia and now we're moving on. In that sense. Normally, if you want to make something legal, it does involve a bit of a legal framework. So you need to think about any kinds of regulations you're putting onto it, any exceptions that you're going to put onto it, ways in which you're going to make sure that people have access to the information that they need around it, and a variety of those other sorts of issues. It's not always the case. You might choose to legalise something from a very principled point of view and say that you didn't really think there should be any legislation around, regulation around it at all. It's entirely possible that you could say, want to legalise prostitution, and because what we really believe is everyone has a right to do anything they want to with their body, we don't think the government will have anything to do with this. Any person can ask any other person for money to have sex with them, and the government's just not getting involved. But if that's what you're going to do, if you're going to not have a complicated legal framework, then you also need to say that, okay? Because it won't be assumed that that's the case if you don't say it. So you either need to explain what your regulations and your framework is, or explain that it's deliberately going to be absent in that case. When you're banning something, it doesn't usually take the same level of detail of framework, because something that's banned is banned for everyone, something that's banned isn't regulated in that kind of sense, it's just gone, it's not allowed, it's against the law. Obviously the key things that you need to decide upon and put in your definition are what's the punishment going to be if something's banned, if somebody ends up doing it, and that should reflect why you're banning something, how bad you think it is, if it's bad in an immoral way, or if it's just bad in we think it's bad for people way. You're probably going to have different sorts of punishments, but think about ideas of punishments, think about whether or not you're going to have a criminal record for things, imprisonment, fines, compulsory doing of things. We talked about compulsory parenting classes the other night, and you can talk about those sorts of things as well. So there's a range of things that you can put into punishment. And the other thing is it might need to be mentioned or flagged up in a definition. In some cases, you might need to think about how something's going to be enforced. All right, some things it's okay and easy to enforce. If you're dealing with some of those issues of legalising we just looked at, seem to be sex issues that happen entirely behind closed doors in a bedroom. How on earth do you enforce laws of those sorts? So if it's a case like that where there's not an obvious enforcement, then you might need to think about that in your model in that way. But coming on then to think about this general idea of when we're going to say we're going to ban or legalise something, we're asking for the government to take an action, the government to either intervene in banning something or to stop intervening in legalising something. Because I think that's a good place to start in terms of we can have a sort of general assumption that given that the government are only human as well, are only individuals, possibly our neighbours, possibly us one day, who've been elected in to represent us, that they're not some kind of super power that just get to make any decision for us because they might get to make it better than us. They don't get to say whether or not we eat so much at lunchtime that we feel like really full and really sick. Maybe they might be able to make a better decision than us on that. They don't just get to make our decisions for us. So we kind of assume that we're allowed to make all of our own decisions and be free and autonomous individuals and beings within society to an extent, unless something happens and there's a reason why that can get taken away. So we don't start off with an assumption that the government can do whatever it wants and then have to prove why they shouldn't be able to. It's more the other way around. We assume that the government doesn't get involved and doesn't stop us from doing something unless there's a reason for it. And there are different levels in which you might want to look at that. Sometimes we want to say that the government should ban something, or if you're on the opposition of a legalised motion, because you actually think that they have a duty to do it. Okay? Somehow they are going against their actual responsibility and duty as a government if they don't ban something, or if they allow something to happen. That's the strongest way in which we say the government has to do that in that sense. So for example, if we're saying that we want to ban parents from smacking their children, you could argue you actually think it's a government duty to intervene to protect children in that case. The second level is more the sense of the government is justified in doing something. They have a right to do something. And there's lots of things that the government does that it has a right to do that it doesn't necessarily have a duty to do. Okay? The government has the right to, in the UK at the moment, the government's changing the final age of compulsory school. It's raising it from 16 to 18. Probably you wouldn't argue that that was just their duty and that somehow they were going to be not fulfilling their duty as a government if they didn't do that. But we would say that they have a right to do it because they have a right to govern the education system in that sense, in that way. So make a decision quite early on about whether or not you think that something is a government duty or it's just that the government has a right to do it, they're justified in being allowed to do it.
But this, for example, isn't that then a rather weak case, or wouldn't most debaters try to make it a duty because just saying we will do it because we can do it?
I think there are lots of cases where you ban something for a really practical reason and then you explain why the government is justified in doing that, rather than necessarily saying that they have a duty to in that way. But if you feel happier going with duty, you can do. But sometimes you'll be doing more than you need to in that case. That doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's often like a very strong, go kind of for a strong principle in that idea. But sometimes it's worth saying, are we really saying that they absolutely have to do this, or are we just saying that they have a right to do it, that it's within their remit in that sense that they are?
It's a different level whether we say duty from within the government or because the reasons are this and this and the world looks like this and this, we should do it and therefore.
Yeah, I think that's the sense. So I think that, as I say, you've got to make your own call on a particular debate in that sense. Because I mean, even on that parental smacking one, you can make an argument that says government has a duty to do it because government has a duty to protect children in that sense. Or you could say that the government, you might look at on another side and say the government has the right to intervene on the way parents bring up their children if it's harming the children. Okay? Now it's a slightly different emphasis. It's going to essentially lead you to the same argument, but in different cases you might want to choose a different level. Yeah.
So just so I understand, the difference that you're asserting here is practically a framing matter, not that it actually could be substantively different.
No, I think it only becomes different in terms of how it's going to be attacked, I think, really. Because when you think about how you're going to attack something then, obviously something it's easier to... It takes less to attack a duty than it does to attack a right. Because with a duty, you're kind of saying they're actually remiss if they don't do it. Whereas with a right, you're just saying they're perfectly within their right to do this. So it makes a slightly different emphasis in terms of how the debate's going to go in that sense. But if you're happiest kind of thinking for the most cases that you want to think about sort of duty in that sense, then you can almost always put the analysis around it. But it's worth thinking that you do have that choice, and that is an area of kind of, the subtlety of the differences of the way you can put these arguments forward. Now, in terms of when we think about whether or not the government does have a duty or a right to intervene in banning and legalising motions, we tend to say that there are three different reasons why the government might intervene and stop you from doing something. Firstly, you might be put forward the idea that the government has to protect individuals from themselves. Secondly, that they have to protect other third parties from harms that are inflicted onto them. Or thirdly, they need to protect the interests of society as a whole. And in any given debate, you might have 1, 2, 3, or all of those issues at play. So let's go through them one by one. Firstly, an idea of whether or not, and I'll look at both sides of how these arguments work as we go through each one. If you're suggesting that you want to ban something in order to protect individuals from themselves, the kinds of issues that this might be is you might be banning smoking, banning gambling. It might be an issue that's involved on the opposition of legalising prostitution, or legalising the sale of organs, legalising sadomasochism. These are sort of issues where there isn't necessarily, and straight away as the obvious first justification, a harm to someone else. It would mainly be a harm to the individual. Now, obviously, it's a philosophy that we hear a lot. People stand up in debates and say people should be able to do whatever they want if it only affects themselves. We should only step in and start to stop people's behaviour, change people's behaviour if it's going to affect other people. Because in the end, just go through this argument, because if you're on the other side, you want to make this argument. If I'm an adult, a rational being, I have the ability to look at information, assess risk, and make decisions for myself about my own health, my own happiness, my own length of life, and a variety of situations in that idea. The other side, therefore, has to kind of say why the government should be allowed to make some decisions for other people and individuals in that sense, why they shouldn't allow these sort of rational adults to make their own decisions. So bringing this into some debates, I might say, we should legalise prostitution because I'm perfectly capable of making a rational decision about whether or not the monetary reward that I could get from selling my body is something that fits in with, that I think would be good for me, it will fit in with my morality, it doesn't, my personal sexual morality would allow that, it would bring me in money, it would allow me to continue my studies, I want to make a rational decision, I've looked at all the issues, I'm going to use protection whenever I want to do that. With something like banning smoking, or kind of the drugs issue, I might kind of say, look, I know the risks, I know that smoking or taking particular drugs are going to almost definitely seriously threaten my health and potentially shorten my life. I am happy to make the decision, I'm a rational being, I've got all the information, I'm happy to make the decision that I think smoking or taking drugs is going to increase my quality of life enough that I'm going to make that rational decision that I want a shorter and more fun and happy life. Government, you might have this idea that the ultimate objective has to be to keep people alive for as long as you possibly can. That's not my assessment. I'm not interested in those extra 20 years in the old people's home. I want to have fun now. Let me. Okay, and that's not saying, no way saying in that sense that everybody would make that same assessment, but the opposition argument to do that is these ideas of freedom of choice is that we're perfectly capable of making these decisions for ourselves, and that it's wrong for any other body to come in and intervene and try and make those decisions for us in that sense. So the proposition has to show, or an opposition, depending on what side of the ban Legalize they're on, the side that wants government intervention has to show why we shouldn't let people harm themselves in that sense. And there are a few kind of ways of doing this, different arguments that come in. This is where every individual debate will have its own set of arguments. But there are a variety of ways, for example, where you talk about the fact that people are not in a position to make a free and fair choice. Okay? And there are different groups of people that fall into this. For example, with young people, you might talk about the fact that people can make a decision that when they're young that will affect them when they're old in a way that they can't properly rationalise, or that they don't properly rationalise. Any debate where addiction is involved, you can say that addiction removes any sense of a genuine free and fair choice. So you might choose to smoke a cigarette, but you don't choose to be a 20-a-day cigarette smoker for 40 years, because once you're addicted, your ability to consent has become blurred. Social and financial pressures, you can say, can lead to a state where people can't make their own proper decisions in that way. So in debates where there's a monetary issue involved, like prostitution or selling organs, for example, you can say that the financial pressures can force people into having to do things that they don't want to do. So that it's the poorest and most vulnerable women who end up in prostitution almost against any sense of their own. It's not that they've made a rational choice of what's best for them, it's that they don't have choices and they don't have options. Yeah.
Now, with the exterior forces argument, like, which way kind of should it be used? Because, like, if the exterior force is there and we just ban what those people are being forced into, the force is still there, and they might be going
Yeah.
into that
But I
thing.
suppose in these debates we'd say that there are other issues that you can talk about poverty, but someone shouldn't be forced to harm themselves, that shouldn't be one of the options that's available to them, to harm themselves because of an exterior pressure. So if you take away that ability to harm themselves, then that's how you're fulfilling that duty. That doesn't mean you shouldn't also have better education and better welfare proceedings in that sense. We're talking about in these sense, it's the idea of looking at how the most often these laws are about protecting individuals from themselves, about protecting the most vulnerable people in society. There can also be issues around peer pressure, social pressure. I don't think it's necessarily as strong as the idea of financial pressure, but again, particularly when you're talking about younger people and you're talking about smoking and alcohol and things like that, I think it's worth thinking about those ideas of whether or not young people are really are in a position to make up their own minds separate from social pressures in those situations. So these are a range of issues where we're saying that because people can't make up their own mind, the government's going to make up their own mind for them by taking these things away from them. And then you have to say why the government is good at making decisions. And you can say that the government is much better at actually looking at things in the long term. They have more information. They have a complete information package. Because even if you do put a cigarette warning onto a cigarette packet, that's not the same as having the expert advisors, having read all the reports, really kind of understanding the risks and the long-term implications. There's more than one of them. A variety of different lines you can go down to show why not only sometimes are individuals unable to make decisions, but the government's actually a good body to step in and make decisions on their behalf. And I think one of the key issues here as well is the idea that when you are making your argument on the other side about how I should be able to do whatever I want to do as long as it doesn't harm other people, that might not be just to the extent that if I smoke and I'm not around anyone else, smoking is probably not the best example in this one. If I say I am perfectly capable, me as an individual, I'm perfectly capable of making a decision about whether or not I want to be a prostitute, and I say that's not going to harm anyone else, it's my decision. Prostitution being legal, and therefore the huge harms of all of those people for whom can't make that decision, means that there is a harm to me doing that, because there's a harm to that activity being legal. So even if there are some people out there who can rationally and safely and by their pure free choice and free will choose to sell their organs or choose to sustain a particular drug habit, if there are a lot of people who can't, then you can restrict the rights of those people who can in order to protect those who can't. Okay? So you can say it's not so much of a fundamental right for you to have access to internet gambling, even if you can do it really sensibly. We think it's more important to protect the people who are going to ruin their lives than it is to allow you to be able to engage in that particular activity. So sometimes protecting vulnerable individuals does involve restricting the rights of some people who may be capable of making a rational decision or a rational choice in that sense. Has anyone got any questions about that first one, about that idea of how on either side you can think about whether or not individuals should make decisions for themselves or governments? I'm just looking at the time actually, maybe we should kind of keep going through and get some questions at the end. I won't spend as much detail on all of them. The second one then is the idea of protecting other people, protecting third parties, why the government might restrict something that you do because it has a harm on somebody else. So there are lots of clear, obvious moral ones in these grounds, the idea that you're not allowed to murder somebody because then somebody else is dead. Okay? That you're not free to do everything because other people have to be free from what you do. It's these difference between positive freedoms, in that sense, your freedom to do something, and your freedom from something in that sense. So if we talk about some issues to do with freedom of speech sometimes and things, we say, well, it's my freedom, it should be my right to say something. But then you might talk about there being another, if there are implications of what I say, that somebody else ends up getting beaten up, then those people also had a right to be free from being beaten up. So I will restrict your right to do something in order to protect someone else from something. And in almost all of these debates, you can find third-party harms. Okay, there are often a lot of third-party harms. And in terms of thinking about how debate goes and thinking about extensions, there are often other third parties that haven't been covered by the first half of the table who you can look out to. If you go through those ideas of, how does it affect families, how does it affect particular professionals who are involved in any given situation, things, you can often find these ideas. But with something like banning smoking in public places, this has been done all over Europe now, that's done on a third party basis. Okay, they're saying you can smoke in your own home because you're harming yourself, but if you smoke in somebody else's workplace, they will suffer from passive smoking, and so that's not allowed. There's a third party harm in that sense. We don't want you to smack your children, not because you're harming yourself, but because you're harming your children. It's very rare in a debate that you'll ever get an opposition to that of people should be allowed to inflict harm onto other people. The opposition will almost always be a more practical one of there isn't that harm that you say there is, or that harm isn't that great, or people are able to get themselves out of that harm without something being banned. Okay, so there isn't necessarily the principled objection to that you tend to see in debates. So protecting other third parties, think through those different people who might get affected, but that will almost definitely end up happening on a practical reason of whether or not they really are affected, and if they're affected badly enough to restrict someone's rights.
But if we buy into your framework of comparative rights and always competing rights, and the weighing mechanism that involves would always mean that one side is always harming the other, and thus we must choose which harm is greater, right?
Well, no, because in this sense what I'm saying is I might restrict someone's rights to do something in order to protect a group from something being done to them. Okay, so it's a kind of idea of freedom to and freedom from. And you're not free to do everything if it affects someone else without them having done anything. Okay, that's the sort of difference in that sense. And that's why we generally say you can't do whatever you want. If I punch you, I might be exercising my freedom to swing my arm, but as soon as I punch you, your rights have been damaged. Your right not to be hit has been damaged, and at that point we'd say I'm not allowed to punch you. That's assault. So it's not a balance of rights there; it's a protection of you.
But don't you still then have to weigh, because it's easy with the hitting, but for example with the euthanasia, where it's your right to die, for example, but then wouldn't say it's certainly a right, but you want to protect the families or other old people from being scared that this might happen to them, then don't you then have to say, well, which right is more important, the being afraid of the other old people of being maybe passively killed, or the right of those old people that want to die?
Yeah.
Don't you then have to?
I mean, there are definitely as you say, there are all sorts of third-party harms that you can look at in a debate like euthanasia. The family, the doctors, other people who end up feeling a pressure to do this when they don't want to do it. So you almost need to decide in a way, why is this really illegal? Like, is this illegal firstly because you think that the individuals themselves need protection, and that's a strong way that a lot of people run this. The idea that you're not irrational, you can't make a rational decision about ending your life. The very decision to end your life is irrational, and also this idea of the pressure that people will feel on them, so they're mainly protecting themselves. And most people would say that's the reason why they're against euthanasia. And then you've got these additional problems to third-party people if you legalise it, like the problems to the doctors and the problems to family. But most people wouldn't say that the reason why we make euthanasia illegal is because it has a harm on the family or a harm on the doctors.
But this is exactly because you've weighed the reason, then the other reason seems so much smaller compared to this one. But it's
but it doesn't matter in euthanasia because you start with the harm to the individual. But there are some cases where there isn't any harm to the individual, okay, where all of the harm is to someone else, like smoking in public places. Clearly it doesn't affect the individual, right? So I'm going to smoke somewhere else. So it's all about third-party harms in that sense. In some debates, or the smacking debate, some debates there is no harm to the individual whose right is being restricted. The harm is all to somebody else. So that's one of the reasons. But yeah, once you've got, if you're debating one where you are protecting the individual from themselves, all those additional arguments and additional extension arguments and things you can get can often be third-party harms. But when you look at them, they're not normally the reason, the prime core reason that you need to prove in order to prove your case. In that way, you need to prove that you're protecting the individual, and then you've also got all these great additional advantages of protecting other third parties from things in that sense. So the third kind of idea is this idea of protecting society as a whole. So it might not be protecting a particular individual child from being smacked in that sort of situation, but there's somehow society's interests as a whole is going to be served by preventing individual rights. So, for example, in a debate on banning private education, you might be talking about the society as a whole is being damaged by private education because you're getting a two-tier system of education which leads to and perpetuates inequality and elitism. We don't want that within society, so we're going to ban those individual rights of people to pay to send their children to school because it's in the interest of society as a whole. Or sometimes environmental issues come onto these kind of grounds. We're going to ban people from having private cars or from driving cars in city centres. We're looking at the idea that society as a whole, it's in their interest and because of the interest of the environment, either a local environment or a global environment. So we're going to restrict individual people's rights in those grounds in that sense. On the other side, again, you're probably going to make arguments about how actually you don't think it does harm society, but it is okay as well. There's definitely a kind of notion of argument here that you can accept that even if there's a small harm, you think that people in the end have the right to fulfill their own destinies, to do what's best for their own children, and to spend their money how they want in those sorts of ways. So you can take that one on a principle ground, but you normally take it on a practical ground as well. I should say, I suppose, as well, on the first argument about the harm to the individual, you can attack that on a practical level as well. Someone says, oh, we're banning drugs because they're really, really bad for you. You don't have to accept that they're terrible for you and then make the principled libertarian argument. You can, of course, also make arguments about how you think that the harms are not as great as the other side have put them forward as being in that sense. You don't have to agree with the harm. So there's always a practical way in which you can come back at the harms that are being put forward in that sense. But you've also got some of those ideas of the principles behind it in that way. Just to run through a few of the other types of arguments that often come out in these debates, I think if a debate on ban or legalising something is going really well, is really good, then these are probably going to be the big core issues that are raised from the beginning, that are going back and forth with clash all the way through, really getting to the nuance of how this general analysis particularly applies in the case of what you're talking about. Because obviously some things are always going to be banned and some things are always going to be legal. So it's really about taking this specific issue and seeing how that issue really applies to these areas. But it's not going to be the only argument in the debate, as well as the principles and practicalities of the harms of the particular thing you're banning. You often get arguments about the black market. Okay, whenever you're banning or legalising something, people tend to want to talk about the black market. And it can come up in a number of ways. Sometimes somebody wants to legalise something because it's banned at the moment, there's a black market in it, and that black market is really harmful. So that could be true of things like prostitution or drugs. Okay, and if you're going to make that argument well, you particularly want to show why there's something about the black market itself that makes those activities so harmful. So you talk about the idea that it's not necessarily the drugs themselves that are so harmful, but it's those drug dealers and the things that they cut those drugs with that are having those real harms. Or it's not prostitution itself that's so dangerous, it's the pimps and it's its attachment to the drug dealing world and the violence that prostitutes suffer. So the idea that if you take something out of the black market, you can actually make it better, you can make it safer, you can put the regulations onto it that mean you're actually improving things for people in that sense.
Like for organ transplantation in that case.
Yeah, there'll be another example. Now, of course, there's not a black market in everything that's illegal. There's not a black market in S&M.
Smoking. No black market in smoking.
Well, black market's legal, but smoking's legal at the moment. I'm thinking about things that are illegal. I suppose you can only have a black market if it's a commodity that's being bought and sold. And there are plenty of things that are illegal at the moment that aren't things that you buy and sell.
But
Okay.
even euthanasia, like it's nothing can buy and sell, but still there is this kind of
That's not a black market.
underground.
Yeah, okay, but something happening, even though it's illegal, is not the same as a black market, because market suggests that there are people there buying and selling and doing something. If you're talking about something like the fact that some family members do already help with assisted suicide, that's not a black market in assisted suicide. That's an argument about how something can't be enforced, or about how desperate people end up being criminalised. But it's not the same as that idea of where you have professional criminals in a black market who are prospering, normally related to organised crime, who are prospering from preying on vulnerable people because there's an illegal black market. So that's one type of argument. But yeah, there are other arguments where things are illegal, but there's no black market there. So you do need to think, is there a black market there in that sense? One of the other ways you often use a black market argument is you can say, even if you make this thing legal, there's still going to be a black market. Okay, so for example, you could say with prostitution, you're making prostitution legal, but you're saying it has to be in brothels and you have to be over 18 and you can't have any STDs and you have to use condoms and all the rest. You can say, well, that's fine, you might be creating a new, safe sexual entertainment industry, but all of the women who are under 18, who already have sexually transmitted diseases, who take drugs, who are illegal immigrants, are still going to work in the black market. And there are still going to be men who don't want to wear condoms and who want to do things that you're not allowed to do in the nice sanitised brothel, who are still going to go to them. So you still have your black market in prostitution, but all you've done is now create a new legal market for stag do's or something in that sense. So you have to show sometimes why the black market will disappear in that way. Various ways that you can do that. You can talk about the fact that people do prefer not to break the law if they have the choice. Talk about if things are going to be made cheaper, if things are going to be made safer, a variety of ways that you can do that in that sense. From the other side in that sense though, what about these black market arguments? If you ban something and a black market is formed, you might still think that's better than it being legal. You might still say, okay, less people are going to do it, less people are going to have access to it, you're not going to be able to have adverts for it that are going to tempt people in, and we're not going to be complicit in it. Okay? If there are some people out there still taking heroin, it's not for fault of trying. It's not because we didn't criminalise it and try and get the people who are taking it out there and do massive education campaigns against it. All right? So just because you can't stop something doesn't mean you have to become like legal peddlers of it in that way. So you can say, even if we can't get rid of it, we prefer to have a situation where there's less of it, and here's why we think there will be less of it, and where we are not complicit in it. Equally with the argument of, would there still be a black market if you legalise something? Well, firstly, you probably want to show why you think it will be significantly reduced, as I say, through the ideas of safer, cheaper, legal. But again, you can probably say that even if some people are left in it, the majority of people are going to come out of it. So we're still helping the majority of those vulnerable people by bringing them into a legal framework. So there's a few things on black markets. Black market is rarely the key issue in a debate. All right, it's an important issue often, and you should analyse it well under those kinds of grounds. But it shouldn't take over a whole debate. I don't think on banning and legalising. Some other issues that sometimes come up that, again, you might want to think about if you're sitting in closing government and they really have done everything and they've named every third party harm you can possibly think of and dealt with the black market and all the rest. There are arguments about money. Particularly, a lot of these issues are issues where things cost money. Not all of them, things like smacking or S&M and things don't, but a lot of them do. Gambling, alcohol, smoking, drugs, prostitution, a lot of these things involve money. So you need to think about how money works if something's illegal or not legal. These can be, arguments about whether or not something's going to be taxed and whether or not something's going to bring money in that way, whether or not you bring money into your legal economy rather than having money in your illegal economy. and issues like that. Resources issues around it as well. If something is banned and is being enforced, is that putting resources of police and court time and government time and prison space and things into something that you don't really think deserves it? That's kind of all these money resources arguments. Do you have an issue with the fact that something is illegal might be really funding things like terrorism and serious organised crime if they're making their money through dealing drugs? Is it better that you take that money out of organised crime network and bring it into your own economy in that sense? So there are a variety of issues around resources, but again, on the other side you might say, well, there's so many problems associated with this and so many more people are going to do it if it's legal, that you're then going to have the burden of resources from the healthcare system or from the legal system and things, of all of the problems that come out of what you're doing. And depending on whether or not you're at an international competition or a national competition, this one's different, but it's worth thinking about international implications. So if you're within a situation where you're debating a ban or legalise within your own country, you're talking about your own government doing it, what are the international implications of your government making that decision? Be that things like if just Britain legalised drugs, would that mean that we would get drugs tourism from other countries where drugs are illegal? And if so, is that a good thing because it brings tourist dollars into our country, or is that a bad thing because it essentially creates a sort of seedy district, crime-ridden districts in that sense? If Britain legalised drugs, what would our allies like America, who are fighting a war against drugs and have based a lot of their foreign policy around that, what would they think about that? How does that sort of affect ideas in that way? The laws that you have, if people are crossing over borders, if other countries legalise euthanasia, does that mean that people from Britain can go to Switzerland in order to get their assisted suicides or things? Things that you can do can affect people across borders in other ways. And that's, again, I think there aren't very many debates where you'd start with that, but it can be an interesting area to think about in extension if you're looking for new ideas and new material to go to. And I've got to the time that I'm supposed to finish talking about this. So just to sort of sum it up in that sense, banning and legalising, remember to think about it's not just whether or not the thing that you're banning or legalising is good or bad in that sense. It is really key about that idea of why, when does the government make laws, when do they intervene, why do we allow them to do that, and how does this particular activity or product fit into that sort of framework in that way, and see how it goes through in that sense. Yes?
I'm going to give you some curveballs. So those are the standard ban and legalized one. In the new world of the East and West clash, of course you heard that in certain country your headscarf is banned. So headscarf for Muslim. So in France you can't wear it in the school. In Singapore you can't wear it too. But in some country they insist that you wear it. So they have different. So if you say ban headscarf for the Muslim in the secularized school, then all those arguments you have won't work because it's nothing to do with rationality, first party harm, third party harm, and society. It's got to do with preservation of religious ideas and cultures. I'll give you another one. In Singapore, we have this law which inherited from her country. It's called 377A, which bans sodomy, which is the sex between men. So the ban the ban on homosexual sex has never been lifted for the past 150 years. And the government justification was this: they won't enforce the law, but they won't take it up because they feel that's a real argument. They feel that the people in Singapore are conservative and they're not ready to accept homosexual. Therefore, the law is use the ban on homosexual is a symbolic gesture of the government to tell.
And I think in those cases, both of those cases, I'd put under my third idea of protecting society as a whole. So in that last example, it's like protecting the sensibilities of your
Yeah.
society, who are, you know, and with a religion one, yeah, I think that's really worth bringing up. Some
Yeah.
ideas when you're protecting society as a whole, in that
Yeah.
sense, it's not really society as a whole; it's a group within society. You know, a particular religion or a particular culture. Or a particular group who speak a particular language or something, and so yeah, there is that jump between, you're right, between third-party harms and whole of society, which is a particular group within society that you either want to protect, or who you're saying, well, I'm afraid their rights are going to have to be subsumed for individuals or for society as a whole, in that sense. So yeah, that's a good way to think about that. So. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much indeed for that.